They called me the future of African finance. I was 29, in a glass tower above Nairobi, where the sun looked like a coin pressed against the sky. My shirts were always white, my tie always straight. I believed in systems, in numbers that didn't lie, in balance sheets that told the truth better than any preacher. I came from the plains, a village that didn't have numbers, only stories. My father died counting cattle. My mother sold vegetables by the roadside until her hands turned the color of the earth. When I graduated, she said, "Bring our name into light." I thought light meant success. I didn't know it could also mean exposure. The first time I saw the relief fund portfolio, it was printed on glossy paper, thick enough to smell of foreign ink. Billions, assigned to counties I could barely pronounce anymore, my home among them. I told myself I'd protect the money, allocate every cent with discipline. But the numbers were too many, and I was too alone among them. At the office, they called it redistribution, a sterile word for something that already smelled of heat and hunger. My colleagues joked that corruption was just an advanced form of survival. I laughed then. You laugh, or you're marked as naive. At night, when the city lights blinked like dying stars, I checked my accounts twice, not because I doubted the math, but because I wanted to believe it was still just math. There was a woman on the 11th floor, Clara. She handled PR, dressed in imported linen, always smelled faintly of mango and printer toner. She told me I had a good face for the future, that my signature carried confidence. She said she liked men who made things move. I liked how she said move, as if everything, even morality, could be adjusted for efficiency. When I got promoted, the headline read, "A New Generation of Integrity." I framed it on my wall. My mother called to congratulate me, her voice small over the static of old cell towers. She asked if the drought had ended. I told her it was getting better. I lied before I understood why. Every morning, I drove past men sleeping on cardboard, their hands outstretched like calculators that had stopped working. I looked away, told myself I was building something bigger, a structure that would one day lift them. But every good lie begins with an architecture of intent, and mine was flawless. The famine began like a rumor. At first, it was only words: shortage, delay, distribution error. Then came the photos: children with matchstick arms, mothers with eyes too dry to cry. Each report came folded neatly into my inbox, another wound turned into a spreadsheet. We called it allocation. That's how bureaucracy buries pain, with terminology. I signed the first approval with steady hands. The ink didn't tremble, but something inside me did. When the second wave of funds arrived, the zeros doubled. The press called it the largest humanitarian injection in a decade. I called it an opportunity. One night, Clara leaned over my desk and whispered, "Do you ever wonder how much of this will actually reach them?" I shrugged, pretending detachment. "Less than half, probably. That's just logistics." She smiled. "Then why not control where it goes?" That sentence stayed with me like perfume on skin. Why not control it? After all, wasn't I trained to optimize outcomes, to reduce waste? If I redirected a portion to better channels, wasn't that efficiency? It began small, a transfer to a shell partner. Temporary storage, we said. I created layers, networks, names with no faces. The money moved faster than morality could follow. Every justification sounded rational when written in policy language. In meetings, I became the architect of adaptive reallocation. They applauded me for speed, for precision. International consultants requested my models. The World Bank cited my reports. But the real applause came in silence. The quiet click of notifications as new accounts were confirmed. Clara and I began traveling for field audits. In dusty towns, we inspected warehouses filled with sacks that held more air than grain. The locals lined up to greet us, clapping as our convoy passed. Their gratitude was a mirror. It showed us what we wanted to see. In the evenings, in hotel rooms scented with disinfectant and heat, she'd say, "We're not stealing. We're protecting the funds from incompetence." I wanted to believe her, because believing her meant believing myself. We began to buy things, small at first, watches, suits, a house with too much marble. Each object whispered, "You've earned this." But the whispers grew louder. Soon, ministers called me brother. Foreign investors invited me to golf clubs where the grass stayed green even when the rivers dried. I told them about Africa's resilience, about fiscal hope. They nodded and poured me imported whiskey. Every night I balanced 2 ledgers, one for the world, one for myself. Both looked perfect. Then the rain stopped again. Villages that once sang hymns under acacia trees now sent reports of mass displacement. Still, my models showed progress. My mother called once more. Her voice cracked. "The cattle have died, son. The church is feeding the children mud cakes." I told her help was on the way. I was the help, and yet I was the delay. That night, I dreamed of numbers dripping red, zeros turning into open mouths. But in the morning, the market surged. My company's valuation doubled. The boardroom cheered, and I told myself mercy could wait 1 more quarter. I used to think hunger was silent. Now I know it hums, low and steady, beneath every applause, every clink of glass. The year the drought deepened, I bought my first sports car. Metallic blue, imported, absurd against the dust of Nairobi's streets. The roads outside the capital cracked like the skin of a dying man, but my car gleamed, a moving confession in the sun. I told myself symbols mattered, that seeing one of us succeed meant the system was working. But the truth is, I just wanted to feel invincible. Every night became a blur. Polished floors, champagne, politicians laughing too loud. Clara's bracelets clinking like tiny chains. We called it celebrating growth. They called it networking. But it was hunger too, just dressed in silk. I remember one night vividly, a gala for sustainable aid innovation. The chandeliers looked like frozen tears, the guests like saviors rehearsing guilt. A foreign donor asked how we maintained transparency amid volatility. I smiled. Accountability is our moral compass. The room laughed. I laughed too. It felt good. That laughter built from lies. Clara leaned in, her hand brushing mine. "You see," she whispered, "they want to believe we're the good ones. Give them a story and they'll sign anything." And they did. Millions approved overnight. We flew to Zanzibar for the weekend, stayed in a villa built on coral. From the window, the sea looked endless, forgiving. "Do you ever feel guilty?" I asked her once. She kissed me and said, "Only poor people can afford guilt." For a moment, I believed her, but the world has its own accounting. When I closed my eyes, I saw spreadsheets pulsing like veins, contracts curling like burnt paper. I began to hear the hum again, not in my head, but in the silence after the music stopped. One night, a driver from my hometown came to see me. He had dust on his shoes and hope in his eyes. They said you control the food shipments now, he said. The trucks stopped coming. The children, I cut him off. We're reallocating. Temporary disruption. He stared at me, confused. So they wait? Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. They waited last year, too. When he left, I poured another drink. The glass shook. The hand that once signed salvation now trembled. But indulgence is a tunnel. You don't notice the air thinning until you're crawling. Clara started traveling less. She said the atmosphere in the office was changing. Whispers. Audits. I smiled, pretending calm. Numbers don't lie, I said. She looked at me then, eyes tired, and murmured, No, but people do. That night, the city lost power. The neon signs flickered out, and the darkness felt honest. I stood at my window, staring at my reflection, a man surrounded by light that wasn't his. And somewhere out there, the people whose hunger built my empire were still waiting for rain that would never come. The first crack came quietly. A journalist from a local paper, the kind no one took seriously, published an exposé titled Ghost Grain. He wrote that entire districts listed in our reports no longer existed, that aid trucks had vanished on paper trails that led nowhere, that a certain finance director had approved it all. That was me. At first, I laughed. You learn early in government work that truth is negotiable. But then my inbox froze. My access credentials were revoked. The board called an emergency meeting, not to ask why, but how far it had gone. The minister didn't shout. He smiled. These things happen, he said. We just need a scapegoat. The word hit me harder than accusation. I drove home through rain that felt like dust, my windshield streaked with mud the color of rust. The city looked cleaner than I remembered, like it had already erased me. Clara didn't answer her phone. Her apartment was empty, her perfume gone, her silence absolute. For the first time, the room smelled like paper. Old, burning paper. Then came the numbers, all the wrong ones. Accounts frozen, assets seized, my name replaced by a case number. On the news, my face appeared beside starving children. They said I'd stolen the future, that I'd traded rainfall for whiskey, bread for marble floors, that my signature was written in the blood of the poor. They weren't entirely wrong. I left the city before dawn. No one chased me. There was no need. Guilt travels faster than any police car. On the road north, I saw villages I'd once known. Empty schools, wells turned to mirrors of mud. A child waved at the convoy I wasn't in anymore. I waved back, but she didn't see me. By the time I reached my hometown, the market was gone. The cattle were bones in the dust. The woman who once fed me porridge from her palms sat by a broken pump, her eyes hollow. She recognized me, not as the boy she'd raised, but as the man on the radio. Son, she said quietly, did you really sell the rain? I wanted to explain that I didn't steal, I managed, that I didn't lie, I delayed, that I didn't destroy, I optimized, but all that came out was silence. The old church still stood. The bell was cracked, but it rang, a dull metallic echo. I went inside. Dust floated through the sunlight like ghosts of grain. I knelt, not to pray, but to listen. And in that silence I finally heard it, the hum of hunger, the one I'd tried to drown with laughter and numbers. It wasn't rage, it was absence. I buried my face in my hands, and for the first time in years I smelled the soil, not as dirt beneath my shoes, but as something I'd abandoned. The papers said I fled. They weren't wrong, but I didn't run from justice. I ran from echoes. I rented a room in a border town by a dried-up river that once divided two nations. and now divided memory from forgetting. The walls were cracked. The fan groaned all night. Each morning I walked to the riverbed and stared at the pale stones, trying to remember what water sounded like. I told myself I'd stay until the noise died down, until someone else became the villain of the week. But guilt doesn't fade. It ferments. There's a rhythm to remorse. It starts with denial, then logic, then finally, the questions that don't want answers. At night, I wrote letters I never sent. To my mother, to Clara, to the children in the photos. I wrote to the journalist who exposed me, telling him he was right. I wrote to the man I used to be, telling him I forgive his ignorance, but not his hunger. The world moved on. New scandals bloomed. New heroes rose. But famine has no season. It lingers like a ghost in the grain. One afternoon, an aid worker knocked on my door. She was young, maybe 20, wearing a shirt with a faded logo that once belonged to my department. She asked if I could help her verify some records, old files from the previous administration. I almost laughed. When she showed me the papers, I saw my own handwriting, neat and certain. My signature on 1,000 false hopes. She didn't recognize me. She called me sir, thanked me for my time and left. I stood there holding the files, my hands shaking. That night, I walked back to the river. A few children were playing there, tossing pebbles into the dust where water should be. One of them looked up at me and said, "It used to flow." I nodded. "Yes," I whispered. "It used to." Then, without thinking, I began to dig, just with my hands like a fool. The others laughed, but a few joined me. The soil was dry, hot, unyielding. But under the first layer, there was dampness, faint but real. For hours we dug, until my palms bled. By dusk, a trickle appeared, thin, hesitant, glistening in the dying light. The children gasped. One of them cupped her hands to catch it, as if holding a miracle. And I realized the water didn't matter. It was the act of digging. That night, I wrote one final entry in my ledger. Debit, greed. Credit, memory. No balance sheet could ever reconcile that. But maybe confession doesn't need balance. Maybe it only needs witness. So I left the files by the river, open to the wind. Numbers that once hid my sin now floated into the dark, page by page, dissolving like ash in air. Months passed. The world forgot my name, but the land didn't. Seasons came and went like half-finished prayers. Dust settled where crops once grew, and people learned to live with less food, less hope, less faith in men like me. I stayed, not because I was brave, but because there was nowhere left to run. I began helping the aid workers, quietly, under a false name. I translated reports, reconciled inventories, showed them how to trace missing funds through the maze I once built. It felt like dismantling my own crime, one formula at a time. At night, I slept beside the river. The same one that once mocked me with silence now murmured faintly. Small streams threading through the cracks we had dug. Children played nearby, their laughter raw and uncalculated. Each sound felt like forgiveness I hadn't earned. One morning, the sky turned gray, not the color of drought, but of promise. The first drop hit my wrist, warm, heavy. Then another. Then 1,000. People ran out of their homes, faces tilted upward, mouths open. Rain. After 5 years of waiting, it had come back. I stood in it until my clothes clung to my skin, until the dust washed from my hair and the mud rose to my ankles. Somewhere behind me, the old church bell rang again, fractured, trembling, still trying. A woman's voice called my name. I turned, and for a moment I thought it was my mother. It wasn't. It was a young volunteer carrying a clipboard soaked through. She asked if I could help her tally the new shipments, the grain arriving with the rain. Her smile was the kind that doesn't demand history, only presence. I nodded. We stood under the same storm, counting sacks of maize that might, finally, feed instead of vanish. And I realized something I'd never written in any report. Hunger isn't only the absence of food. It's the absence of faith in one another, in the possibility of good. That night, I returned to the ledger one last time. The pages were warped from moisture, the ink bleeding like memory. I wrote only one sentence. To those I starved, may your children never know my hunger. Then I closed it and placed it under a stone by the river. The sound of water covered everything. Shame, regret, the pulse of the past. The sky stayed gray for 3 days, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Because sometimes, redemption isn't the cleansing of the soul. It's the willingness to stand in the rain and not hide anymore. They said hunger was a curse, but I learned it can also be a mirror. In every famine, there are 2 kinds of thirst. One for water and one for worth. I tried to feed my pride and starved my people instead. Now, when rain falls, I don't count the drops. I just listen, because somewhere in that sound, mercy is still speaking my name.